Right.
And there we go.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate those of you who have taken the opportunity to join us for our flock talk today. This topic is going to be summer troubles, so we have a few different segments that we're going to be talking about. My name is Lynn Bliven. I work for Cooperative Extension in Allegany County, and we're going to kind of jump right in here. Please make sure if you have questions, you can pop them in the chat and or just unmute yourself and ask questions as we go. Pretty small group here, and we want to be informal, so we have some information to share, but we also want to give you an opportunity to make sure that you have your questions answered, and or if you have things that you want to share with the group, that would be good as well. So I'll kind of move forward here into the um, first section. We're going to talk about predator control. And as I said, I'm going to lead off here, and then I'll hand it off to my coworker, Nancy Glazier. And any of us that have had chickens have experienced loss to predators. Certainly something we want to try to avoid, whether it's, from an economic standpoint, we don't want to lose birds, but also you're taking good care of these animals. And, it's can be devastating, whether it's a single bird or certainly if it's a larger amount of your flock that's affected. So when we deal with predators, a big piece of it is really what can we do to prevent it? So everything loves chicken, so all kinds of wildlife are potential predators for our stock. And the things that we can do is to make sure that we have good facilities for those birds. So whether or not you're using mobile pens, if you got stationary facilities. So we're going to talk a little bit about first, the type of predators, the things that we want to be considerate of, and then obviously we'll go into some of the types of methods we might use to prevent specific predation, given, if you've had some experiences here. So this is just one of my mobile pens. There's some Buff Orpingtons in the foreground and the pictures behind, some of the Cornish cross. In addition, most of us don't have perfectly level ground. So you can see I've just added a little strap of material there to help buffer things as they, move those pens across the ground. Again, just preventing an opportunity for something to reach underneath it or look like there's a visual way for them to get in. And of course, with these heritage birds, we also don't want them to get out. So that's another thing about, are we keeping birds in, and we're also keeping predators out. So part of it needs to be determining what we have. So we have a couple examples here. Certainly hawks can be a predator. Generally, they're going to take birds during the day. You may actually not even see or realize that there's a bird lost. So again, if you have large numbers, you may not realize it until all of a sudden your large numbers are significantly smaller and realize that they're feeding on your birds. The one picture there is a red-tailed hawk. I had a breeding pair behind my house for a number of years, and you can have wildlife commingling with poultry. I didn't lose birds to hawks. I lost them to a lot of other predators, but some of the things that we design in our systems can help prevent that. Owls can be another one. So this picture here is a screech owl. We're more likely to see it from our perhaps like a horned owl or something like that will take a bigger bird on. But owls generally are going to be feeding during the night. So that might be, again, are your birds disappearing during the day? Are they disappearing in the night? Maybe give you an indication of what you've got out there. Again, as I already shared, everything loves chicken. So there's a whole host of predators that may be out there. So certain signs that you may see, egg loss might be more likely to be, rodents and or snakes. Egg loss, you may see eggs from possum. Coons will also take eggs. But some of those other ones that we have there, so we have a picture of a weasel. They can get into through a very small hole. And so if you're seeing birds with, missing heads and a lot of blood, that might be a weasel. It may also be, again, going back to like the mobile pens, what I was showing, you can have coons where they'll work together and they'll kind of scare the birds from one side of the pen while another coon is reaching in on the far side and attacking the birds. So you may see, parts of the bird on the inside of the pen, parts of the bird on the outside. That may be an indication of coon. Fox are very savvy. So we'll talk about some deterrent measures, but they will come and check every day to make sure if there's an opportunity to get in. And they'll take both chicks and larger birds. Amy probably can speak to the fisher issue because I believe she had some fisher challenges. They can be pretty ferocious predators and something that we want to be cautious of. Coyotes, we may have some, it's more opportunistic. But again, there's a wealth of information out there about the types of predators and what they're might be causing. Certainly don't want to forget our domestic animals. So in a lot of cases, maybe coy dogs, which are, or wild packs of dogs, or it may be your own household pet or the neighbor's pet. I came home one evening and found my neighbor's 2 golden retrievers on top of my mobile pen. They couldn't get at the birds to kill them, but I did actually lose some through stress because they just kept running around the pen and chasing them. And so domestic animals can certainly be a challenge. Everybody loves kittens and they're cute and cuddly, but with kittens come a mama cat. Again, just something to think about in my brooding situation a few years ago. I didn't realize it because I had started out with a large group of chicks, so had about 120 chicks in the brooder. Basically the mama cat discovered that was a good food source, so was coming and plucking a chick or two a day to feed to her kittens. So something else to think about in your setup, and what would you do to preclude them. They're more likely, again, to take smaller birds, very young birds, but certainly can be devastating losses. Okay, I'm going to shift it over to Nancy.
Thanks, Lynn. And I'm Nancy Glazier. I work for the Northwest New York Dairy Livestock and Fuel Crops team. It's a 9-county regional team. I'm going to talk a little bit about control methods. And I don't think there's a one size that fits all. There's probably a bunch of different things that you may have to utilize to help control any kind of predators. You see in the top picture with the hen house, that mobile hen house there, it's a shelter for those hens to go in at night. And that's one of the big pieces to start with. The birds need that secure location at night. That just helps deter some of our predators. There's a pretty good perimeter fence around that, along with the temporary fence, and they're both hot. So that just is another deterrent. For birds of prey, it's really helpful to have the temporary fence set up in a long, narrow rectangle. The birds just have a hard time figuring out how to get down there and get a bird, get a chicken. So that's helpful. We've got some pictures of some cattle here, a cow and her calf, and that maternal instinct in general will help deter predators from the pasture. If you have meat birds or layers out on pasture, it's just that larger animal, whether it's beef cattle, sheep, goats, that just helps deter some of the pests, predators. And also even guardian dogs will help. And we have a hunting dog actually that does a pretty good job of keeping some of those predators out of our yard. So just kind of a multiple facet, different opportunities there. And I'm not sure if Lynn mentioned it, but it's really important to keep whether it's a mobile coop or a, broiler unit, whatever it may be, keep it away from the hedgerows if you can, keep the grass mowed. That's less tall grass for the predators to hide in. They don't feel as safe sneaking up on those chickens that way. Lynn, you want to go to the next one?
Sure. I did actually, there was Mary shared a comment that she found 2 dead Cornish in their coop this morning. Sorry about your loss there. Didn't want to share the picture, but wondering about rats. Certainly rats are a possibility, and they will partially eat them. It could be, so they were almost like they were skinned. So that's a possibility. If they didn't remove it at that age, I would say that might be a very valid possibility. Other thoughts from the group?
Yes, the downside to those small predators, weasels, rats, they can get in a pretty small hole. If it's over an inch, they're going to be able to get in. Sometimes, that inch they can squeeze through depending on the age of the predator. So that's an unfortunate situation. They can dig in at night too, depending on what that predator is. Amy's shaking her head. She's had some experiences recently, so.
I have experiences almost every week with predators. So.
Yeah, that's the one thing with chickens. Most people that have birds, they're out in rural America, so that just opens up the opportunity to predators.
Come on, let's go. Come on, Elena.
Just some other deterrents. The top picture there with the fox, it's kind of a motion sensor where a light will come on. Sometimes they can play music, play sounds at that point. It just helps deter any predators. The night guard on the right, I've used one of those for many years. Excuse me, it's got a solar charger in it, so it'll charge a battery, and then at dusk the light will flash on and off. We have kind of a mobile hen house just for a small flock, and we move that around the yard, so it does a great job of deterring the foxes we've had issues with in the past. There's another option. There's a whole slew of repellent granules out there. This one pictured, it's an organic product, it's non-toxic, and it just is another way to deter any kind of predators, those smaller ones. Excuse me, and any kind of flapping, fluttering, pinwheels, those sorts of things just help deter, I would say more so in the daylight hours, any of those predators. Sometimes it's important that you move those around as well, just so animals don't get used to those being in one location.
Nancy, I did want to interject real quick, if you don't mind. The night guard, when you install them, you want to make sure that they're more or less kind of eye level with the coyotes, or whatever they might be.
Foxes or something. Yeah,
a little bit down lower to the ground, so up high doesn't do too much good.
Right. It's supposed to make a predator think it's like an eye of another animal kind of flashing at it. So if you have it lower, it's more of a simulation to that. So thanks. So there's other options as well, whether it's trapping, there's live traps out there, but then again, you have to relocate those animals or they'll just return another day. For any kind of, leg traps are some of those other options. You need to make sure that you have, if there's any permits needed, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation has a couple of web pages where you can go and learn about nuisance animals, nuisance mammals, and what you can do when they start to damage your property, which that includes loss of livestock and poultry. So it's really important to follow those rules beforehand as you start controlling pests in that way.
And I will pop that
Okay.
thing in the chat box. I was typing that out. So it is important to remember things like there are some restrictions you can't on catch and release. So some of that has to be done by a licensed nuisance wildlife person. And most of these predators have to have a permit in order to be able to trap them, even if they are for nuisance.
Come on.
Okay.
Okay,
So I'm going
thanks.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Proscia. Whoops.
sorry.
That's okay. I'm out of the Cornell Cooperative Extension office in Sullivan County. And I was tasked with talking about summer pasture and free range management. Generally, what I'm going to speak about is not as in depth as we could go. Obviously, we could talk for hours and hours about pasture and all that sort of thing. So this is just a brief skim over, but if anybody has any questions, we can certainly talk about that after, or do a whole new class on it. So do you advance for me, Lynn? All right, so why do we want to raise poultry on grass? Well, it's a big cost saving measure. It's an opportunity to diversify as far as moving your animals, not only right on in a barn setting. You can do it out in a pasture, you can do it in fields, different things. It's a low initial investment, which is nice. Depending on what kind of infrastructure you want to do, you can shoot for the moon and go all golden structures here, or you can reuse what you have around the barn, which is nice. The idea is that it'll increase fertility on your pastures because of all the manure that'll be dropping throughout. You do not need a ton of land. If you are able to rotate them well enough, you can see that depending on the size of your flock, you don't need too much land. And of course, it's complementary to multi-species rotational grazing, which is nice if you have many different species on your farm. You can still use the same pasture and just manage it correctly. So what they have, there's two ways of kind of classifying per se. There's probably more, but generally I like to call it either free ranging or pasture ranging. So, or raising. For free ranging birds, basically you have like a perimeter fence around a certain structure, whether that's a coop, egg mobile, chicken tractor, whatever you want to call it. And the idea is, I have pictures too, don't worry. The idea is that you want to put your waters and feeders kind of away from the coop to encourage movement outside of that particular area, because you want them to move throughout the pasture. You don't want them to congregate right up next to the coop, because they will. Sometimes chickens are lazy, and that's okay. Even depending on the species, some will be more lazy than others. So you want to encourage them to exercise and move and kind of work for their food a little bit. And I wanted to throw this definition in here real quick as the USDA definition for free ranging, because you'll see this on packages, in the supermarket or farmers markets, depending. And basically it's that they have access to outdoor space for at least 51% of their lives. Okay, so just a little knowledge I wanted to throw out so you know the definition. You can advance, please. So I did throw, there's so many great options for pictures. I did like this one, and for some reason I never thought of doing a coop this way. It's like it's a chicken tractor, but they roost on the ground, so you don't have to have an understructure on this point for the free range area. But keep in mind, as Lynn and Nancy talked about before, chickens are usually prey. Everything likes chicken, right? So you want to have an area that they can maintain kind of their natural instincts and not feel frightened all the time, I guess you could say. And you want to provide them with shade, shelter, somewhere to get away from the sun. Sometimes folks have bushes or trees. You can throw in some perches in the coop, but the idea is that they can, get away from if they sense danger or, just want to get away from the elements. So bushes are nice for, you also see it in like quail with pheasants. Folks will throw their old Christmas trees or cut down trees to give them shade and shelter as well. Next. And here's some pictures, just as some examples of some free ranging poultry. Again, you'll see the electronet around the outside of a coop that's generally moved throughout the pasture. And, the water and feed are outside. So they're sectioned off into a certain area, but then, that you can move throughout the pasture. Next, please. Then we have pastured poultry. These are poultry that are kind of sequestered into a certain area, generally in portable houses. Now, keep in mind that these definitely need to be moved frequently, more often as the birds age, because there's more poop. So you need to move them more frequently. They eat more, they scavenge more. So here's just a couple examples. I found this one on the right and I liked it. I thought it was a cool idea. It's probably a little more of expensive build, depending. You might be able to source some materials, but if you can see, this is on the bottom here, this is kind of building off of Lynn's idea with her chicken coops there, is that there is some wire mesh fencing on the ground to prevent burrowing from different area or animals, excuse me, that can potentially try to bury under and get at your chickens. So, you know, if you are having a big predator problem, that might be a solution to extend out some wire mesh. And you can make these as big or as small as you need. Just realize you have to move them. So, and I've moved a lot in my day. So as far as pasture goes, what you're looking at is your vegetation should be around 4 inches high. I'm not saying that you need to go out with a ruler every day, but you know, you can see these big Cornish crosses here. They're just kind of, they're not moving amongst the grass as well, because you know, it's a bit higher. So basically they're just flattening it down. And the whole idea of putting them out on pasture is that they use the pasture, right? They use it for, you know, scratching, digging, eating bugs, some grass, hopefully, and to build on that protein level that they have. So don't forget that even though they are out on pasture, they're not cows. They can't just live solely on grass there. So you want to estimate that your pasture is about 1/3 of their diet. So you still have to feed them chicken feed. And studies have shown that raising your birds out on pasture or grass increases the omega-3 fats of the eggs, and of course increases vitamin A and E as well. So it's a benefit. Next, please. So some basic shelter requirements. You know, you don't have to go crazy. You know, you don't need any construction plans too much here. The idea is that you provide them shelter from rain, wind, sun. However you want to do that, you know, and what works for you. That's, you know, you can use tarps or, you know, wood or any of the other kind of materials that you can think of. People use a lot of those pack crates. I'm drawing a blank on what they are, but the packing crates, you know what I mean? Anyway. So one concern though is when you're moving about pasture, as Lynn spoke about, that you know, we don't have even ground. So when you're setting the actual coop, make sure it's not in a low spot, because if we get rain, there tends to be flooding. And if they're kind of sectioned off into one area, they can't get away from the water. And you know, you never want really wet birds, because it just leads to problems. So you're looking at about 1.5 square feet of bird space is what you're estimating for the amount of birds provided for the shelter. What's outside, you know, that is up to how intensely they graze and how much poop you get on the ground. So just keep in mind, you want at least 1.5 square feet of bird space. And of course, throw your feeders and waterers out away from the coop. So what are we planting in our pasture if we're seeding or overseeding? You basically want some kind of mixed seeded pastures. These birds like things like clovers, legumes, some very palatable, you know, orchard ryegrass. You want to make sure that what you have out in your pasture, they want to go for, they want to eat, because you're trying to use the pasture, right? What's the sense of putting them out there if they're not going to get after any of these grasses that are out there? And again, some of these legumes, of course, they don't grow so tall, so they keep down to that kind of 4-inch level that you're looking for, which is nice. You don't have to mow, you don't have to bush hog, anything like that. So, and of course, they're higher in protein as well. And if you are doing something like rotational grazing, and you are trying to figure out what you want to put into, you know, seed your ground with, just take that into consideration, that, you know, you want some seed mixes that work best for all animals that you're grazing. So chickens can be a little harsh on pasture, just depending on how much you move them. So you have to move them frequently. And again, I can't stress it enough. I'll show you some pictures that'll give you an idea. But you know, they do drop a lot of manure on the ground. So You want to make sure that you are moving that to spread that manure around your pasture efficiently. So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship. It's something that you don't have to fertilize your pasture to keep the yield high on your grasses. You can have the chickens do that for you, right? That's kind of a free fertilizer per se. It limits scratching of the ground, which does allow the pasture to recover eventually, because if you leave them for too long, you can really damage it. And of course, the healthier the pasture, the more wildlife, well, insects, bugs, worms that you can get into the pasture, and that is, in my opinion, free food, right? That's what they're out there for, and it helps, keep ticks down, things like that. And of course, moving prevents erosion on your pasture. So here's a great picture that will show you the, I use damage loosely because the pasture will come back and a little bit stronger, especially with the increased manure on there. But you can see this is more like a Joel Salatin moving system here with his little chicken tractors. But you can see how they need to be moved frequently, and how that the chickens really get at a pasture. You can see all the different blocks here. So just keep moving, make sure you have access to water. They have those large square drums that you can keep water. You can do gravity fed water or feed, or put it on the back of a truck. So just keep that in mind when you're identifying pastures that you want to put chickens out, and how you're going to get water and feed out there. Next, please. A little bit closer up on the pasture here, as you move the chickens, you can see they kind of really bed it down. They pick out what they want, they fertilize it, and you just keep on moving. So just cite the area that you want your chickens on to best benefit you. Here is just another idea. If you were doing more of like a free ranging system, you can have in the center kind of a stationary coop, and you can rotate the electronet fencing or whatever fencing you're using counterclockwise or clockwise, doesn't really matter, in order to give the pastures time to rest and regrow and provide more food for your chickens. So I spoke about this a little bit earlier, but sharing pasture, if you are doing multi-species rotational grazing, again, with that kind of 4-inch height of the grass that you're kind of going for, you might want to send out your larger animals ruminants first, and that way they can kind of eat the pasture down if it's really high, and you want to move them anyway when it gets to kind of a shorter level as far as the grass height goes, because that's where parasites live. So you move them, then you can move on your poultry after, where they can pick at all the bugs, they can eat at that lower level, and it would be symbiotic. So you can rotate with other poultry as well. Just keep in mind that some poultry do share disease. So chickens can be carrier for what they call blackhead disease, which does have a high mortality for turkeys. So my advice would be, if you did want to rotate your turkeys and chickens, I would rotate turkeys first and then follow with chickens if you need to. Okay. So your basic things to consider is what kind of system you're working with, pasture, free range, broiler, egg production, what kind of shelter and equipment you need as far as the coop, electronet, fencing, waters, feeders, if you have the space for how you want to rotate them or move them throughout your pasture, and the space for the coop as well, if it's big enough for the birds, the amount of birds that you have. Keep in mind the labor of moving these coops around. Make sure that you're available, once, twice a day, depending on the size, and make sure that you either maintain your pastures as far as adding seeds, or if you want to improve your pastures, go ahead and do that prior to putting them out. All right, thank you.
So I will be last today. My name's Amy Barkley. I'm the Livestock and Beginning Farm Specialist with the Southwest New York Dairy Livestock and Field Crops Program. And today I'm going to talk about mitigating heat stress. So we're at this time during the summer where the sun's pretty hot. Some parts of Western New York and the Northeast are experiencing cooler temperatures, but other parts are experiencing very warm temperatures. And should those warm temperatures come back, we need to make sure we'll be able to manage them properly. I'm going to talk a little bit first about the biology of chickens and how they mitigate heat stress on their own. And then I'll go into ways that we can help them mitigate heat stress as poultry caretakers. So the first part of this I want to introduce you to is a topic called the thermoneutral zone. This is the zone of temperature where a bird will feel most comfortable and they will be able to perform their metabolic processes, whether that's growing, maintaining, or laying eggs, without any added energy. Of course, if you're moving up like a broiler that's moving through its production cycle, it's going to need different amounts of energy, but this is in general talking about how it relates to the external temperature around the bird. When I'm talking about this thermal neutral zone, 55 to 75 is where they're most comfortable. Like for us humans, I think it's somewhere around 70, but birds can tolerate a little lower because they're feathered. Surprisingly, they can tolerate a little higher, even though their body temperature is around 106 degrees. So they're pretty comfortable in that range. Okay. Once we start hitting around 80 degrees, that's when the bird's going to start feeling uncomfortable and where she is going to start doing things that are going to limit the amount of heat on her body. I should say before I go any further that 75 to 80 degrees or whatever heat range I'm talking about is not necessarily ambient air temperature outside. It could be, if the chickens are barn raised, it could be the ambient temperature inside the barn, and it should be that for comparative purposes. And then another thing to consider is when you have birds out on pasture, they're likely in an area where it's sunny. And so somewhere that is 70 degrees might actually feel hotter to the birds simply because the sun's out. Just some things to keep in mind as we go forward. Now, as birds start to experience warm, that's where they start to get a little bit uncomfortable. For us humans, it might be where we just start to sweat, but we're not dying, right? So with birds, what they'll do is they'll open up their wings and they'll start to get some airflow under their wings. They might lay on the ground, they might stretch out their necks, just trying to get cool. As we can see, this poor little duckling on the right-hand side is pretty warm. He's compressed into the ground pretty much as far as he'll go, and he's got his beak in water to help both drink the water to cool his body and also to have that beak in water to allow for radiative transfer, which we'll talk about in a couple slides. All right, so radiation. Shouldn't have said radiative transfer. It's actually conductive or convective, but 6 and 1/2 dozen of the other as we move forward. All right, so radiation. Radiation is reflecting a portion of the sun's rays to reduce heat penetration. And generally speaking, a darker bird is going to be more susceptible to heat stress than a lighter bird, simply because when they're outside, they're absorbing more of the heat through the sun's rays. The next thing I want to introduce you to is the idea of surface to volume ratio. Let's think about broilers for a second. So a 2-week-old broiler is probably about the size of a baseball, and an 8-week-old broiler is probably about the size of a basketball. Generally speaking, that 2-week-old broiler has more surface area to the volume of body of that bird, whereas the basketball-sized broiler has less surface area to volume. The reason why this is important is because as our volume increases relative to our surface area, the harder it's going to be to cool through some of these, I'll call them steady state means. So not really incorporating a lot of effort on the bird's part. This is why we see a lot of heat stress in older broilers, especially death losses is usually when we hear the news of heat stress. And it's going to affect the older birds simply because they can't dissipate heat as well. There are some species of birds, this is wild birds mostly, but this can be also associated with our domestic birds, that turn their bodies to allow the more reflective parts of their bodies to radiate the sunlight. So if they're in a situation where it's really sunny, they don't necessarily experience as much heat stress because they're very careful in how they orient their body. And as I said before, lifting wings can be a way to dissipate heat stress as well. You can advance, Lynn.
Sorry, it's stuck.
That's okay. I
There
figured as
we
much.
go.
Happens. All right. So conduction is our next topic, and conduction is a physical interaction with the bird to their environment. That could be something like dust bathing, where they're taking cool sand or dirt and they're fluffing it up in their feathers. That helps cool their body. Waterfowl will splash in water, and there's both conduction and convection going on right there, but the physical contact of the water with their body being cool helps to alleviate some of that heat. Searching out shade is a no-brainer. Laying on the ground, kind of like how our pets will lay on our tile or wood floors in order to feel cooler during the summer. Chickens don't have the luxury of wood or tile floors, but they will lay on the ground to help dissipate heat. And they'll also increase their water consumption because by consuming water, especially cool water, they can reduce the amount of internal heat within their bodies. There's also this really cool thing that birds have that we don't. It's called the countercurrent exchange system. And you've probably seen this in regards to shorebirds, such as the one pictured here. But this is really true for all livestock species, and it's primarily used by waterfowl. But what this is we have in the leg a vein and an artery. The vein, well, I'll start with the artery. The artery is taking warm blood away from the heart, away from the body, the main body of the animal, through the foot, and then the vein is taking the cooled blood and moving it back up towards the heart. Now, depending on how cool the area is where that bird's foot is going to impact how well or how much cool or heat dissipation happens and how cool that blood is as it travels back towards the heart. So for waterfowl, we see this goose splashing here in the water. That goose is taking advantage of some convective transfer, but also the conductive transfer of having its feet in the water where that countercurrent exchange system is helping to reduce some of its internal body temperature. When we think about convection, it's the movement of a fluid surrounding an object which provides the cooling potential. This can be air or it can be water. So when that chicken's lifting her wings up to get airflow under the wings, the movement of the air against the warm air radiating off the bird is a convective transfer. Same thing with water. So as the water touches the bird, moves away, that water is picking up some of the heat and moving it away from the body. And this is impacted by feathering. So something like a Cornish cross broiler or a hen that is the favorite of roosters is probably going to cool better during a convective transfer than a fully feathered duck, for instance. Breed also impacts, like I said, fully feathered laying hen may be in this circumstance versus a broiler, and of course the size of the bird. And birds can't sweat, and that really stinks for them. If birds could sweat, they'd be really able to dissipate heat, but we'll talk about the other option that they have to dissipate heat in the next slide. Actually, a couple slides. When we talk about the temperatures getting up, so we talked about 80 degrees is where the bird starts to feel really uncomfortable. They have a slight reduction in feed intake. You might see some reduced performance, but it's not too bad. You're probably not going to have birds die. But as that temperature keeps climbing up the range, the effects are going to be more severe. Most of that's going to come from A, either a drop in feed consumption, or B, just overheating and the bird not being able to regulate its body temperature. As we climb higher and higher in the range, it's going to get worse and worse. So it might start out as eggs are getting sandy shells and egg whites are watery. But as we move further up into that heat spectrum, just say we have a heat spell that lasts for a long time, this could turn into a drop in egg production entirely. The birds might not lay at all. And for meat birds, what might happen is they might have issues with their meat quality, which we'll discuss in a little bit. But as we get to the very end of that range, what will happen is the bird cannot physically compensate for, it cannot physically cool itself enough. And it will lay down on the ground, stretch out its neck, try its best to cool itself off as it's panting, and eventually it will succumb and pass away. All right, so this is the avian respiratory system as compared to the human. And the reason I want to talk about this is because when birds pant, they are expelling a lot more moisture than humans would. And that's just the makeup of their body systems. So in humans, we breathe, we expand our lungs, we expand our diaphragm, and air flows into our air sacs and oxygenates us. We breathe out, that air moves out, carbon dioxide moves out. But with a chicken, they essentially breathe in and out on every in-breath, which is a little complicated to understand, I suppose, but I'm gonna try to break it down. So the bird, I don't have a pointer, but if you could follow the diagram, the bird's breathing in air. She takes it in and puts it into what's called air sacs. They're like balloons that are all over her body and in her bones, her wing bones and her leg bones. And what they do is they'll fill up with air, and then on the next breath, they'll transfer the air up into the lungs, which are inside the backbone. They're embedded in the backbone. They don't actually inflate like ours. They're just there. And so the air sac inflates, pushes air into the lung, air oxygenates, pushes into another set of air sacs, and then pushes out of the bird. And the reason why this has been created is so the bird can be more efficient in flight, but it also allows them to cool themselves through a different way, respiration instead of perspiration. So panting is the exchange of moist, warm air from the respiratory system to the drier outside air. The reason why the air gets moist is because all of those air sacs in the lungs themselves are made up of tissues which have a lot of moisture on their surfaces. So when the air moves through, it does its exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, but it also picks up water droplets as it moves out of the end of the bird. And as the bird does this, as it pants more and more, it has a more rapid CO2 exchange. And when this happens, the blood becomes more basic. Now, why does that matter? Most species operate where the pH of their blood is around 7. It's neutral, it's like water. But as that system's upset by an increase in carbon dioxide exchange, that bird is not able to regulate its metabolic processes properly. So if you have too high of a pH in your blood, it could impact how calcium works. And so it impacts shell quality, or it could impact how protein works. So it could impact how well the egg white stands up. And so that's why we have these experiences, is because of this exchange. Now we also have things like dehydration happening, just because if the bird's not taking in enough water, it's expelling a lot of liquid through its breath. And if it doesn't replenish that, it will dehydrate. And then breathing itself is a process that involves muscles and energy. And when it uses energy, it's heat generating. And so heavy panting, especially in an environment where the bird cannot release enough heat. So I'm thinking of maybe perhaps a barn that's not well ventilated, that just has high humidity. That bird can't blow off enough of its internal air and exchange it with cool, dry air, because that air doesn't really exist. So that's a circumstance where the bird's going to continue breathing, and that will result in overheating and could end up in death. Another way where this could happen, where the bird overheats, is if they're in a pasture and there's a lot of tall grass around them. The reason being is that grass is also respiring. So it's also taking in CO2, releasing O2, opposite of birds, but it's still breathing. And it also releases some moisture. In addition to that, you've got the ground surface, and the ground surface has moisture on it as well. So we take a hot panting bird who's releasing moisture, we put it in a moist area where it's kind of surrounded by grass, and then we expect that bird to cool off. Well, even though there's relatively good airflow, the reality is that bird is not going to cool off as well as it should, and may succumb even if there is a slight breeze, or maybe if the temperatures aren't into that danger threshold that we showed in the previous slide. All right, so enough about biology. Let's talk about environmental mitigation factors. The first and most obvious is to increase airflow, and that can be by fans, that can be through opening vents or inlets. But the thing to keep in mind here is that opening vents and inlets may not be enough if there is a stagnant surrounding environment. It works really well if you have windows on the west side and the east side of your coop and air can just move through, but otherwise it might not be enough. So going into your coop and feeling what that air is, or having a hygrometer or a thermometer in your coop to measure what the humidity and temperature are a good backup, just to make sure that your birds are comfortable. Next is to provide shade, especially if those birds are out on pasture and they don't have the option of going under a tree or such like, and make their area in which they live cooler at night. That may be increasing airflow, that might be keeping bedding dry, but by keeping their living area cooler at night, what happens is even if during the day they're overheated, during the night time, their bodies are going to cool down and they'll be better prepared to attack the next day and be able to dissipate their extra heat. Another reason for keeping bedding dry is because bedding that is wet releases a lot of moisture, and that can cause humidity. I was just in a barn a couple of days ago where I looked at the windows and water was dripping down them, and the windows were open. It's just that there wasn't enough natural airflow through the barn to get the humidity out that was in the wet litter. So by removing any wet bedding as often as you're able to, it can help keep the environment less humid and therefore allow for better blow off of heat from the birds. Okay, cool water is a good idea. Some folks put ice cubes in their water if they have smaller flocks. This is a good idea if you can't replace the water frequently. And then feed during the cool times of the day. So sometimes when it's really, really hot out, birds won't eat during the hottest parts of the day. They'll eat in the morning and in the evening. So you might think about offering more food or more available food or more trough space for those birds to all feed at once during the cooler part of the day. Another option is you can add vitamins or electrolytes, I call them Educator, to your water. It can help mitigate heat stress because it's going to replace some of those vitamins and minerals that are otherwise not consumed via feed and can help keep those body processes moving like they should. And the final point here is if you're feeding either a crumb or a mash feed, mash feeds are typically fed to layers, but sometimes broilers. If you're feeding those smaller particle feeds, you might consider moving to a pellet during the hot season. And the reason for that is research shows that birds will eat pellets to almost excess. They'll eat more pellets than they will mash or crumb faster, right? Because it's a little package. They can just pop it in their mouth and they fill up their crop really quick and they're full. Whereas with the mash and crumb, they really need to take their time and pick a lot of little pieces to fill their crop. So by having pellets available, and especially if you're only feeding during the cold parts of the day or the birds are only eating during the cold parts of the day, you can help ensure that they're getting the nutrition that they need as best you can. Okay, so that's all I have, and this concludes our presentation for today. If you have any questions, comments, or stories you'd like to share, you can either unmute yourself or go ahead and pop them into the chat box. I'm going to right now pop in a link to our survey. This is a survey that we ask everybody who joins in these flock talks. If you've already filled it out, you don't have to fill it out again. But if you haven't filled it out, what it is it's essentially a way for us to quantify what folks are doing here in the state in terms of production, and to also get your ideas for other topics that you want us to present. Our flock talks are presented every fourth Wednesday of the month from 12 to 1 p.m. or 7 to 8 p.m. depending on the mood of the speaker. So we will be sending out announcements to that via our email list if you sign up for on this survey here. So that is all for today. So unless we'll stick around a couple minutes for questions and then we will go ahead and sign off.
We can go ahead and send the recording to the folks that were, came in a little late, that they can get all that information on everything that was presented today. So don't worry.
And did you get a chance to put that DEC link in there?
I just put it in there. I realized that I couldn't switch off of my screen, I think,
Yeah,
while I was trying
thanks.
to type it in. So I did just put that information in there. So that will give you some details on what species of wildlife require a permit, whether or not you can get a nuisance permit. We did talk earlier about some of the methods, maybe trapping. In a lot of cases, there are associations, I'm not sure that we mentioned that earlier, or individuals who actually will do trapping. They may be limited by season, when they can do that. But in a lot of cases, they might be more successful too. So there's actually a link on that page to some of the trapper organizations. So if you're looking to decrease your populations of some of your predator species, connecting with your local trappers would be an effective way to do that.
Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop the recording now.